Hello and welcome to the third presentation of the Fall 2019 season of the Medical History Interest Group. I'm Marlena Rose, Assistant Director of Collections and Historical Services here at Laupus Library. The Medical History Interest Group presentations are sponsored by the Laupus Library History Collections and the Department of Bioethics and Interdisciplinary Studies. If you haven't already done so, please sign the attendance sheet before you leave. Our upcoming presentation will be on Monday, November 11th, Coca, Cacao, and Cinchona, Medical Marvels and Curiosities from the Iberian New World, with Angela Thompson, PhD, History, retired. We invite you to take a look at our other exhibits at the library, many of which are commemorating anniversaries. Here on the fourth floor we have Scientists and Their Microscopes, which shows various microscopes in our collection with images of well-known scientists who use the same versions in their research. In the gallery space, we are commemorating 50 years since our library was founded with the exhibit Laupus Library, celebrating 50 years of history and service. The Country Doctor Museum has been part of the Laupus Health Science Library's collections and historical services since 2003, but they've been open in Bailey, North Carolina since December 8, 1968. The museum celebrated our 50th anniversary in 2018. The reading room includes a display to commemorate that anniversary. The museum also hosts traveling exhibits at the Brody School of Medicine and on the second floor of the Family Medicine Building. We also have two exhibits on the second floor celebrating 100 years of public health nursing in North Carolina, which features artifacts from the Country Doctor Museum and archival materials from the library's history collections. And to commemorate 300 years since the pirate Blackbeard's adventures around North Carolina, we have the Plague of Piracy, which includes photos and artifact cast replicas on loan from the North Carolina Office of State Archaeology and the Queen Anne's Revenge Lab, and is complemented with artifacts from the Country Doctor Museum. Today's presentation is Eastern North Carolina and the 1918 Influenza Epidemic. Our presenter is Layne Carpenter. Layne is the archivist at Laupus Library. She completed her undergraduate degree in history at Westminster College and her Master of Arts in History and Public History at UNC Charlotte. Layne has worked with special collections and museums for over 9 years and has been with Laupus Library for 2 years. Making history accessible to the public has always been her passion, and she loves researching history no matter the time period. After designing an exhibition about the Spanish influenza last fall, this topic has become her latest area of study. Her work in this area has been on exhibit at Laupus Library, Joyner Library, and is on display until December at Wake Technical Community College's Perry Health Sciences Library. Here is Layne Carpenter with Eastern North Carolina and the 1918 influenza epidemic.
Thank you, Marlena, for that wonderful introduction. And thanks to all of you who came to listen to my talk today. I hope you walk away learning something new. I'm going to start with a brief description of how my research on this topic began, and Marlena talked a little bit about that already, but then we'll dig into the history. Okay. This project began as an exhibit for the 100th anniversary of the 1918 influenza epidemic. The exhibit was on display at Laupus Library during the fall of 2018 semester. The modified version of the exhibit traveled to Joyner Library and was on display from January through early April 2019. Currently, a small version of the two exhibits is on display at Wake Technical Community College's Perry Health Sciences Library in Raleigh. In coordination with the first exhibit, I created an online exhibit in the form of a story map, which you can view on the touch table just on the other side of the wall. As I modified the exhibit each time, I continued the research process, filling in the gaps and learning more about how local Eastern North Carolina communities were affected by the influenza epidemic. I'm still tracking down more information, but today I will talk about the experiences of several towns and cities in this part of the state. The exhibit would not have been as successful or informative without the many resources I consulted. I looked at books, journals, and archival collections here at Laupus, as well as artifacts from the Country Doctor Museum and archival materials and microfilm newspapers at Joyner Library. The online repository Digital NC also helped me track down local newspapers. I'd also like to thank Dan Shingleton for his donations to our collection over the years. Many of the public health resources he donated and his knowledge of them were vital to creating the exhibit and subsequently this presentation. Okay. Before I jump into the history material, I'd like to provide a roadmap for this presentation. We'll first begin with an overview of the epidemic and the influenza virus. We'll look at the big picture and provide some context for what was going on in this part of North Carolina. And we'll talk a little bit about where the virus might have began. We will then talk about what the flu was like at the time, including some of the symptoms. We'll provide a general timeline of events and talk about how the flu arrived here in North Carolina. Then we'll move on to the experience in Eastern North Carolina, talking about problems due to the timing of when the epidemic hit and how that relates to World War I. We'll talk about public fear and the role of newspapers, the role of the Red Cross in public activism, treatment, and we'll look at some case studies of Rocky Mount, New Bern, Kinston, and the Eastern North Carolina Fair in Tarboro. Finally, we'll talk a little bit about the aftermath, including the death toll, the Rural Health Act, and public health and the hospital movement. Okay. All right. In January 1918, World War I had entered its final year. But with the impending end of the war came a deadly virus that consumed the world. The disease known as influenza, the Spanish flu, the Blue Death, and the grip infected soldiers in the trenches, civilians in Europe near the war, and civilians on the home fronts far from the conflict. In North Carolina, every community experienced the onslaught of the disease. By the time the epidemic concluded in March 1919, more people died worldwide from the influenza than were killed in the Great War. The disease claimed the lives of at least 20 million people across the world, 670,000 Americans, and over 13,000 North Carolinians, making it the deadliest disease epidemic in history. An estimated 1 million of 2.5 million North Carolina residents caught the flu. At its height in the fall and winter of 1918 through 1919, the influenza virus infected 20% of the North Carolina population. The deadliness of the disease and the inadequate health systems helped North Carolinians realize they needed to modernize the state's public health system. No one knows for sure where the mutation of this deadly virus occurred. At the time, many called it the Spanish influenza because the Spanish press publicized the death toll more than other countries did. Since then, however, many believe it may have origins in Asia or even the United States. Haskell County, Kansas has emerged as a likely culprit, for that community experienced a severe influenza outbreak in January 1918. Many men who were exposed to the disease went to an army camp in central Kansas, infected other army recruits, and all of them took it with them to Europe. Scientists today know that the 1918 strain of influenza was one of the most lethal versions of the virus. This virus strain was possibly a mutation of the bird influenza virus and the human influenza virus combined in pigs and then spread to the human population. Scientists didn't discover the 1918 virus until 2005, despite identifying influenza A and influenza B by the 1940s. The lethal strain of influenza that swept through North Carolina in October 1918 had severe symptoms. The disease began with the typical symptoms of the flu, including body aches, coughing, chills, and fever. However, what made this flu different was the rapid development of pneumonia along with or soon after the flu symptoms, which often turned victims blue from lack of oxygen. Influenza-induced pneumonia was the chief cause of death during the epidemic, and the sheer number of deaths terrified the populace. Dr. Robert Fales of Wilmington, North Carolina, described his experience with influenza as such, quote, "The chief symptoms which I can personally verify were a rapid, progressive feeling of weakness, aching, cough, chills, and fever. Within an hour or so, it was for one to become bedridden and nursed by terrified members of one's family. In many cases, every member of a family would develop the disease eventually, whereas in other families, one or two members seemed immune to the virulent flu." Between early 1918 and April 1919, 3 waves of influenza occurred. The first was in spring of 1918. There was a fairly low death rate. In fact, the flu was so mild that it was easily missed or misdiagnosed in many cases. Some doctors diagnosed it as meningitis, in fact. The second wave was in the fall of 1918, and this had the highest death rate and infection rate. Healthy young adults had the highest death rate during all 3 waves, but it's particularly high during the second. The third wave is early winter 1918 through early spring 1919. Many reported cases, there were many reported cases, but fewer deaths than in the second wave. And most of what we're going to look at today occurred during that second wave in the fall of 1918. Influenza arrived in Wilmington in September 1918, with the first case reported on September 19th. Since Wilmington is a coastal town, the disease spread quickly as people traveled through the ports. A quarantine was instituted, which helped keep the flu at bay in Wilmington, but nevertheless the virus spread. By late September, the disease reached Charlotte, traveling by the rail lines. 5 days later, the number of cases in Charlotte increased from 3 to 140. Camp Green, the military training facility near Charlotte, quarantined the base, but the flu still spread. By early October, most communities in the state began seeing cases of influenza. That October, the University of North Carolina had more than 500 people infected with the flu, including President Edward Kidder Graham. Like so many others, President Graham developed pneumonia and died on October 26th. A few months later, acting university president M.H. Stacy also died from influenza, so they lost 2 presidents that year. Eastern North Carolina communities suffered from influenza alongside the other communities across the state. Most of the towns we will examine today saw the height of the flu epidemic in October of 1918. The ongoing war in Europe and the United States' entrance into the war in 1917 resulted in a shortage of doctors left on the home front. Some doctors volunteered, while others were drafted. In Greenville, Dr. Joseph Nobles was one of the few doctors left when the epidemic hit Pitt County. Another local doctor, Dr. Cecil Garrington of Bethel, North Carolina, whose collection we have here at Laupus, served in the American Expeditionary Forces. As the only doctor in his town, his presence was missed during the epidemic. On April 7, 1919, at the very end of the epidemic, the citizens of Bethel, North Carolina, wrote the letter pictured on the screen. In it, they requested that Dr. Garrington return home from active service. Although the letter does not specifically mention the influenza epidemic, the citizens wrote, quote, you have been away from home for nearly 2 years, and we have been forced to undergo many difficulties and anxieties during your absence. Please, if possible, plead with your commanding officer to recommend your release. We need you here, and we want you to come home. And this illustrated how vital his return was for those citizens. Other communities struggled as well with a shortage of doctors, but the Red Cross and community members stepped in to help where they could, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. With the high infection rate, like I mentioned earlier, at least 20% of North Carolina's population during the second wave, and the shocking death toll, it is not a surprise that fear consumed North Carolina communities. Most newspapers frequently publish front-page articles reporting how many flu cases and deaths a town suffered. Some even listed the names of those who died each day. Newspapers instilled some degree of fear, but they also served as a powerful force to spread the word about symptoms and quarantines. Local boards of health used the press to inform the community of school, church, factory, and warehouse closures throughout the epidemic. And these are some newspapers, one from Farmville and one from Greenville. And I've highlighted the headlines that mention the flu. On the right, you can see where it says the tobacco market will be closed, and it was closed for almost a month in Greenville. Local newspapers also provided information about influenza symptoms and relief. On October 3rd, 1918, the State Board of Health composed a statement which the state government released to the press. Local newspapers published the statement across the state, warning North Carolinians not to share eating and drinking utensils and to always cover their mouths when sneezing or coughing. The board's statement also recommended restricting public events to avoid spreading the disease further. Red Cross chapters provided localized relief to communities during the epidemic. When needed, the Red Cross National Committee also sent additional nursing personnel. One such nurse, MKB of Florida, was assigned to Morehead City, North Carolina. In an article recalling her time there, MKB describes the responsibility of the Red Cross nurses who the committee sent. These nurses typically formed a committee chapter on influenza to work with the local public health officials, organize volunteers to provide care for the flu-stricken, open soup kitchens, and establish temporary hospitals. In an issue of the American Journal of Nursing published in May 1919, MKB described her experience organizing the people in Morehead City. She wrote, "A mass meeting was held in the Red Cross rooms where we organized for work. The town was divided into districts, each district having a committee to make house calls. I was on duty nearly 20 hours a day, the first 3 days after my arrival, and from 14 to 18 hours thereafter, only going off duty when I could no longer stand. From the beginning, the doctors, the volunteer nurses, and I wore face masks made and furnished free by the Red Cross." In addition to the services provided by the Red Cross, community members helped their fellow humans throughout the epidemic. Individuals offered aid to community soup kitchens, while other volunteers organized to care for the sick. The relief work of these individuals was particularly important in rural areas where country doctors were overwhelmed and often ill themselves. This type of public activism was a national phenomenon and demonstrates the goodwill of Americans and North Carolinians alike during this bleak period. The newspaper article on the screen is an advertisement from October 11th, 1918. It was in the Roanoke Beacon, which was the paper for Plymouth, North Carolina. And it's advertising a soup kitchen in that area. One woman named Mammy from Plymouth, North Carolina, described her work in the very soup kitchen that I just mentioned in a letter she wrote to a relative. She wrote, "I have been delivering soups for the last 2 weeks to the sick, those that have no one to wait on them. We have a soup kitchen downtown, make beef and chicken soup, boiled custard, chicken salad, lemon cream, and sandwiches. In some homes, every member of the family would be down with it. And others, 2, 3, and 4 would be sick. We carry things all around town, as far as 10 miles out in the country." As the epidemic worsened by the day, the Board of Health banned most social interaction. As I mentioned earlier, tobacco markets would close, factories shut down, public schools were out of session for nearly a month, and churches didn't offer services. Funerals frequently occurred at the cemetery and not inside churches for fear of spreading the flu further. During the quarantine, local medical professionals insisted that people clean and circulate air in their homes. Keeping windows open to ventilate the home and dilute germs in the air had been a popular protection against disease for decades and was applied once again when influenza swept through the state. In a letter to her son, Maria Whitehurst of Newbern described her thoughts about fresh air and quarantines. She said, "I believe in staying in 5 days after you think you are well and have sunshine and air in your room." MKB, the Red Cross nurse in Morehead City, also described the need for fresh air in her account. Great emphasis was placed on the need of fresh air, cleanliness, and nursing care in every home that I entered. Physicians tried to ease the suffering of influenza patients as best they could. Some prescribed aspirin and morphine to ease the pain, codeine and heroin to control the coughing, and atropine and strychnine as stimulants. Some doctors injected patients with the typhoid vaccine, and some tried quinine, hoping they might boost the immune system. Homeopaths treated patients with gelsemium, an herbal drug. Healthy people prescribed themselves aspirin and quinine, among other homemade remedies they hoped would protect them from the virus. An interesting and kind of amusing find in the Kinston newspaper are 2 brief articles about alcohol as a potential cure. The first article, dated October 9th, describes reports that the government was shipping whiskey to parts where the flu epidemic was particularly bad. The article reported that, quote, "Rye spirits make absolutely the best medicine that can be used in treating the disease." The very next day, the paper said they didn't think letting the anti-liquor laws to fight influenza, or letting down the anti-liquor laws to fight influenza was a good idea, because if the health officers let some people use liquor as a cure, others would take advantage of that. The article continues stating, quote, "A large part of the medical fraternity is new agreed that alcohol is not a stimulant and is not necessary for medicinal purposes." The Kinston Daily Free Press also published brief articles about other potential cures for the flu. A resident of Swansboro sent a Kinston local the following, sure cure. Quote, "Take 1 yard of flannel, cut an opening in the center large enough to slip your head through, heat linseed oil hot enough and thoroughly saturate, and slip over your head and fasten under your arms. Stay in bed. If bothered with cough, mix the yolk of 1 egg, 1 tablespoonful of honey or sugar, 1 to 2 teaspoons of camphor, and 15 drops spirits turpentine. Take 1 to 2 teaspoonfuls at dose as needed." Letters also show documentation of how residents tried to combat the flu. Maria Whitehurst wrote, "I am not taking aspirin. Now I take every night 5 grams quinine and an asafoetida pill. Sadie is taking aspirin and quinine. I haven't been out anywhere since the flu started. I thought best to stay at home." Mrs. Raby of Leggett, North Carolina wrote, "I am taking castor oil and spraying our throats. I do hope we will escape it, for I don't know what on earth we would do if I should have it." Most people were desperate to avoid catching the flu and tried everything they could think of to prevent infection. Some of these remedies might seem strange, but those who lived through the epidemic thought most anything was worth trying. Now I'm going to move on to some case studies to look at specific locations and what the flu epidemic was like in those places. Okay. Mrs. Raby, a wife of a local doctor who was serving in World War I, wrote to her husband often about the situation in Leggett, a small town in Edgecombe County, and Rocky Mount. Between 2 of her letters, only 6 days passed, but the number of flu cases in Rocky Mount more than doubled. On October 2nd, she wrote that there were 400 cases of the flu reported in Rocky Mount. And on October 8th, she wrote that there were 900 cases and 15 deaths from the flu in Rocky Mount. Mrs. Rady writes of Rocky Mount churches turning into hospitals, the stores in Leggett closing, and the general fear of Spanish influenza. In her October 8th letter, Mrs. Rady describes the situation. The epidemic here is terrible. There are 900 cases in Rocky Mount. Every nurse in the Edgecombe Hospital has it, but 2. They are begging for volunteers to go there to help nurse. In Rocky Mount, the churches are being turned into hospitals. Never before have I known such an awful epidemic in this country. The people who have died that I have heard of only live from 2 to 4 days after being taken by the flu. During my research, I found several letters written by Maria Whitehurst, who I've quoted a few times previously, and most of her letters are from the month of October 1918. Maria wrote the letters to her son, Harold Whitehurst, and provided a fairly detailed picture of the situation in New Bern during the epidemic. Based on her letters and some accounts in newspapers from nearby towns, I've been able to piece together a general timeline of events. Around September 30th, New Bern closed all churches, schools, theaters, and the library to prevent the spread of the flu. On October 9th, less than 100 cases were documented in town, but everything remained closed and all residents still took precautions to prevent the virus from spreading. By October 14th, the tobacco warehouses and the cotton exchange closed, and the circus was not allowed to perform. The following day, Maria wrote about some of these events and what it was like living in a town affected by the epidemic. You can't hear anything but war and influenza. Every morning when I read the paper, I have the blues for a while. There are always some deaths of someone you know of, or if you don't, even if you don't know them. The churches, schools, movies have all been closed for 2 weeks, and tobacco warehouses were ordered closed this week. The circus was not allowed to show here after it came, so they went on to Washington, North Carolina. A few days later, Maria received a letter from her son informing her that he had fallen ill with influenza. She responded on October 21st with several warnings and suggestions for how to take care of himself. My boy, you don't seem to know the danger of this influenza. Please stay in bed. You will have pneumonia. I'm worried to death about you. People are dying every direction of town. If I had known you were going on the trip you did, I should have advised you not to go, especially at such a time as this. I should have thought you would have known better. Stay in, don't go among people. I do want to note that the underlined text you see on the screen was in fact underlined in the original letter, so I wanted to keep that. Maria wrote several more letters to her son to check in on him. He did ultimately get better, much to her relief. Still, her reaction to his original letter shows how truly terrifying the epidemic was for all who lived through it, and for the loved ones of the sick. By the end of October, all public functions in New Bern were still shut down. There was a presidential election that year, and the timing of the epidemic made campaigning difficult. Maria writes about this briefly in a letter from October 28th. We are not allowed to have any public speaking, even in open air. This flu is interfering with politics. All funerals are held at the cemetery. Not a single one has been held in church. As I mentioned earlier, that was common during the epidemic to make sure everyone stayed outside because they felt like if people were enclosed in a space, then they might continue to spread the flu. Sometime in November, the epidemic did subside in New Bern and town functions returned back to normal. Documentation of Kinston's experience with the flu is found in their daily newspaper, the Kinston Daily Free Press. The newspaper frequently published about the epidemic, but also was initially hesitant about utilizing quarantines to stop the spread of the flu. On October 1st, the paper reported that the flu had made its first appearance in Kinston. However, the paper notes, it was very similar to grippe, a common malady seen during the period. Nevertheless, the paper published a statement made by Dr. J.S. Michener, head of the health department. He said, "Flu has struck our town. Several cases have been reported. I advise people to let the other fellow go to the circus for them, and the picture shows and public meeting house in general as well. Help the other fellow by covering your cough and sneeze. You may be a carrier or have it in the early stages. The following day, on October 2nd, the paper published an update. While the flu was raging in other parts of eastern North Carolina, there were still only a few cases in Kinston. Dr. Michener and the paper said that there was currently no need to keep kids home from school. But parents were encouraged to send their children to school with clean handkerchiefs every day. Parents were also encouraged to keep their children at home after school and to frequently use antiseptic mouthwashes and gargles to avoid catching the flu. On October 4th, the paper published a statement about how to keep from spreading the flu further. It is criminal to spit or sneeze promiscuously. It is criminal because principally by these means the disease is spread. Sometimes the Spanish influenza kills. So we continue to see the helpful information alongside some fearful language as well to keep people from sneezing on each other and coughing out in the open. On October 5th, the paper reported that the Lenoir County Health Board had met and decided that the situation was not serious enough to warrant closing public institutions, despite other local towns and counties taking this precaution. 2 days later, on October 7th, an estimated 300 cases of the flu had surfaced in Kinston, and the virus was spreading quickly in rural Lenoir County. By October 10th, the county was under an enforced holiday. All public places closed, and Dr. Michener was trying to close the soda fountains as well. The quarantine was to continue for at least 10 days at that time. During the height of the flu epidemic in Kinston, the Red Cross Committee and local community established a free emergency hospital to help in providing relief to influenza patients. The Red Cross treated several hundred people in the city and county in addition to those in the emergency hospital. On October 18th, Dr. Michener asked to extend the quarantine at least another week to ensure the epidemic had passed. The situation was improving with fewer new cases reported, but Michener didn't want to take any chances that it might pick up again if everything went back to full operation. The final case study today looks at a regional fair that was planned for the fall of 1918. Through my research, there were several letters and newspaper articles that mentioned this fair. The Coastal Plain Fair was supposed to be held in Tarboro on October 29th, 30th, 31st, and November 1st of 1918. Throughout the month of October, there was much speculation about whether it would occur or not. A Tarboro resident and friend of Dr. Raby of Rocky Mount wrote about the fair on October 15th, saying, "We are getting ready now for the big fair in Tarboro, but are not sure yet if they will have it on account of this epidemic all over the state. They have cut out most all of them," meaning the fairs in the state. Newspapers wrote similar speculations. Finally, on October 25th, Williamston's paper, The Enterprise, announced that the fair was canceled to prevent further spread of the flu in eastern North Carolina. As mentioned at the beginning, the death toll was staggeringly high during the influenza epidemic. At least 20 million people died worldwide. Over 13,000 North Carolinians died from the flu. The map on the screen was created using mortality statistics from North Carolina and shows the number of deaths per county. I just focused on the counties in the eastern part of the state that I had information about and was focusing on for the exhibit in the presentation. The darker the shade, because I know you can't really read the numbers, the darker the shade, the higher the death rate. As you can see, Wayne County had the highest number of deaths with 1,043. Pitt, Nash, Johnson, and Halifax were high as well with between 780 deaths and 873 deaths. Washington and Craven County were the lowest in the area that I've included, with between 109 and 251. Despite these low numbers in Craven County, the accounts from New Bern and Maria Whitehurst still show how terrifying and dangerous the flu was for them. After seeing the high death toll and infection rate in North Carolina, the North Carolina State Board of Health sprang into action. The board members recognized that the lack of healthcare professionals in rural areas was a major factor in the high death toll in those places. Often, the country doctors who served rural areas were overwhelmed or sick themselves during this epidemic, and so they couldn't care for everyone that they needed to. In a document about rural health from the 1919 Public Documents in North Carolina, the North Carolina State Board of Health recommended, quote, that rural health be provided for by an appropriation, end quote, from the state and the federal government. Dr. Watson S. Rankin, Chief Public Health Official for North Carolina, spoke before the United States House of Representatives Committee on Agriculture in support of the Rural Health Act, H.R. 14185, on February 17, 1919. The bill later passed and provided a rural hygiene program for North Carolina and other states. North Carolina received $50,000 for rural sanitation improvements. Each year, the Medical Society of North Carolina printed their meeting minutes in a publication entitled Transactions of the Medical Society of North Carolina. The meeting included presentations by members and annual reports for the county boards of health. The 1919 volume includes a presentation by Dr. C.V. Reynolds of Asheville, and in it he described the influenza epidemic in Asheville and the precautions the health department took. Also, during the April 14, 1919 session, some counties reported how the influenza epidemic affected their populations. Not all counties were able to report about the flu because their health department was so overwhelmed by the epidemic. The Wilson County Health Department stated that, quote, the epidemic of influenza has been the most potent factor in popularizing the work of our department, end quote. And this demonstrated that following the epidemic, people were much more interested in public health than they were before. During and after the epidemic, the North Carolina State Board of Health did what they could to prevent the spread of influenza. The Board of Health had a monthly publication entitled The Health Bulletin that provided information about quarantine law, symptoms for various diseases, and hygiene and sanitation suggestions. In November 1918, the Health Bulletin published a 2-page spread about influenza, which you can see up here on the front. The article described how influenza spreads, how to avoid it, how to recover after an influenza attack, and what to do after the epidemic has ended. The article also encouraged North Carolina citizens to petition their county board of health to establish, quote, a full-time health department in the county to organize the people and teach disease prevention. The State Board of Health also utilized the newspapers to spread information about the flu. They wrote statements that were published in the papers, described symptoms, and provided ways to prevent infection, such as not sharing eating utensils or drinking after other people. A year after the epidemic hit North Carolina, the Health Bulletin dedicated an entire issue to influenza, which you can also see up here on the front. On the cover of this issue was a drawing that depicted German soldiers shooting Allied soldiers and stated that approximately 1,000 North Carolina men died in a particular battle. The illustration on the screen was on the second page of the issue, and the caption stated that during the 1918 epidemic, 13,644 North Carolinians perished. This striking image in comparison to the death rate during the war compared to the flu demonstrated the importance of disease prevention as well. The influenza epidemic revealed the inadequacy of the existing public health system. Toward the end of the epidemic, the North Carolina Medical Society encouraged North Carolinians to petition their county board of health to establish health departments and training programs about disease prevention. In 1919, the North Carolina General Assembly increased public funding for public health facilities. New hospitals appeared across the state, while existing hospitals required improvements to meet new treatment codes. More county health departments were also established across the state. The increase in public interest and state funding for public health cemented its role and function in North Carolina society. In 1920, the North Carolina State Board of Health published their biennial report. The report presented the budget for the previous 5 years and demonstrated the dramatic increase in state appropriations in the year 1920. The graph on the screen shows the state appropriations data from 1917 through 1921. There is a steady increase in funding each year, but huge increases in 1920 and 1921. These increases demonstrate the investment the state began making in public health and the work of local leaders and public health workers to acquire these appropriations. Hospitals were a key improvement to the public health system in North Carolina in the years following the epidemic. To illustrate this point, we'll look at the establishment of the Pitt Community Hospital in Greenville, which is the first hospital here. Prior to the United States entrance in World War I, Greenville Dr. Charles O'Hagan Laughinghouse attempted to establish a hospital in Pitt County. In 1916, he tried to convince Pitt County citizens to support a hospital bond referendum, but unfortunately, the campaign failed. During the epidemic, Greenville resident E.G. Flanagan wrote an article in the Greenville Daily newspaper, which is pictured on the screen. On October 25th, he wrote, the article was entitled "Hospital for Pitt County Imperative," and called for Pitt County to build a community hospital. Flanagan referenced Dr. Laughinghouse's campaign for a community hospital in 1916 and admonished voters for voting against the bond referendum. Quote, "With a hospital, the medical profession could have relieved many who are now suffering and dying for want of proper attention," end quote, during the flu epidemic. After the war, the campaign for a new hospital began anew. After much effort by Drs. Laughinghouse, Carl B. Pace, E.T. Dickerson, W.I. Wooten, and others to raise funds, Greenville's first hospital, Pitt Community Hospital, opened on Johnson Street on April 24, 1924. Influenza is still one of the most contagious diseases in the world. The medical and scientific community have made strides to prevent more epidemics from happening, but due to the nature of the influenza virus, another epidemic is likely inevitable. As the virus mutates, there is always a possibility that the bird flu virus and human flu virus could combine again. If these viruses mix again, another deadly pandemic could occur. But with more global transportation than ever before, you can imagine how quickly an epidemic could spread. Flyers like the one that you see on the screen, they're created by the CDC. They are still distributed and posted in public spaces across the United States. The methods for reducing the spread of disease are very similar or the same as the ones suggested by the North Carolina Board of Health during the 1918 epidemic, including covering your cough and sneeze and wearing a face mask to protect yourself and others. The influenza virus, like I've said, is constantly mutating, which is why flu vaccines don't always prevent individuals from getting the flu. It does take months to develop a vaccine, and the viral strains used in the vaccine are based on predictions for the upcoming flu season. Their predictions are not always accurate, but the best protection from the flu and a future epidemic is still vaccination. The medical community considers the development of a universal vaccine top priority to prevent future widespread influenza epidemics, and is already devoting resources to this research. And speaking of the flu vaccine, there will be a flu clinic on this floor of Laupus Library on Wednesday, October 30th. So if you haven't received your shot yet, we welcome you to join us. So with that, I'd like to thank all of you for the opportunity to present today and for coming. So I'd be happy to take questions.
If you have questions, please speak into the mic so we can have it for the recording.
Excellent talk. I had heard that the Spanish flu is called the Spanish flu because the Spaniards were not involved in World War I, and then everybody blamed it on them, but they wouldn't take, it wouldn't hurt them to say it was somebody else having it. Did you read otherwise?
Oh, I guess I do have a mic. So they weren't involved in World War I, and because they weren't, I've read that there was a lot of censorship happening in the news during the war, so most of the news was devoted to what was going on in Europe. And you might have noticed that in some of the papers I had up, like the top headline was always about the war. So the countries involved were focused more on that, not as much on an epidemic they didn't think was a big deal. In Spain, it was a huge problem, and I think, in fact, some of their main leaders, politicians, did die from the flu, and so they reported about it because they were not censored. And so that's why it was, at least what I've read, that's why it was called the Spanish influenza.
Thank you for doing this.
Yes.
I was surprised that the strain of the flu wasn't identified until 2005. Did you find anything in your research about why it took so long to identify that?
I'm having to think back. I know it had something to do with the virus dies, like whenever a person who was infected, the virus itself does not, like, you can't research it because it's not living anymore, so you can't study the cells and the makeup of it to understand what was lethal about it. But they were able to find some bodies of, I believe, Inuit people up in Alaska that they were buried in the frost, in frost, so they were able to, not everything died within them, so they were able to extract some of those cells. But it still took a long time for people to finally figure out what was going on and to finally officially find it, because it was just so difficult to work with viruses, especially ones that are that old. Yeah.
Hi, excuse me, not the flu, I hope. Anyway, you mentioned that funds had been made available for rural sanitation. Do you have any idea what that means? What kind of sanitation are we talking about for country folks?
I think it would have meant cleaning up the outhouses and making sure the outhouses were properly structured and not flowing into waterways that people would be consuming, because that was still an issue. That's one major thing. And just being able to provide more health care for professionals within that community, that was the main thing.
Just sort of generic, in other words.
Yes.
Because they really didn't know exactly anything about viruses and where it was coming from, I guess.
Yeah. Germ theory was really fairly new at this point. And so they were just starting to understand how diseases spread. I mean, if this would have happened 20 years earlier, it could have been a lot worse. But they understood that coughing and sneezing on people, or having your outhouse over a creek, or things like that, can make other people sick. That you have to think about that whenever building your home or building your outhouse, or when you're around other people. If you're sick, what you should and shouldn't do.
Makes sense. All right, thank you.
Yeah. And another thing to note is while there were public health departments in North Carolina, they weren't in every county at this time, and their work hadn't gained a lot of traction with the general public. So they were trying to get the word out, but not everyone was listening to them. And after the epidemic was so bad, then they started thinking maybe we should listen to these people. Yeah.
I saw a lot of interesting remedies for the disease. Did you run across any snake oil salesmen, or did they take advantage of the situation from the fear? And did they run ads in the newspapers, or did the government censor them?
I remember seeing, I don't know if it was snake oil, but I know I did read about different oils that were advertised in the paper, but they weren't advertised for the flu. It was for all kinds of other things. But they were being advertised in the papers at the same time, just like deeper into the papers. So I didn't see that too much. There's so many other remedies. Like, I kept finding more and more over. Yeah. I didn't see anything about that. But there's many more than the ones that I mentioned out there. Pretty much, probably any newspaper you look at from the time is going to have something different, some different combination of all of these drugs and herbal remedies that I mentioned. Yeah. Yeah, and liquor. I was really amused by that when I saw it because it said like boo. The article headline was like booze as treatment or something, and I thought that was really funny.
A couple of other tidbits. The microscopes, of course, would not see a virus at that point.
Mm-hmm.
We could only see viruses once we got an electron microscope, which was much later.
Mm-hmm.
So they knew something was going on. They tried to pin down the bacteria. They could never pin it down. So you get these secondary bacterial infections. The treatment was horse serum. The official treatment is if you could figure out what the bacteria was that they got later, you would give them horse serum from a horse that had been infected with that bacteria.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing about the virus was it was particularly devastating among young people.
Mm-hmm.
Older people had probably seen some similar strain in the past, and you would get such a hyperimmune response, you would die in a day or 2 or 3 or 4 with this virus most of the time if you got it. So it was particularly bad about hitting the folks who ran the community and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions?
Oh, I did want to mention something related to that. I did find that some people who caught this version of the virus, or the first edition, I guess, during the first wave, some of those people were immune during the second and third waves. And some of them had no idea they had the flu. Like I said, it was misdiagnosed, or it was so minor but it made them immune later on. Yeah.
Any other questions? Y'all please help yourselves to refreshments on your way out, and sign in if you haven't. And I would want to thank you all for coming here today, and thank you, Layne, for
Yep, thank
speaking.
you.